It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Sarah Lyon Padilla. As you heard, she's a research scientist at Spark. She received her BA from the University of Virginia and her PhD in social and industrial organizational psychology at the University of Maryland. Sarah's research focuses on intercultural conflict and cooperation, immigrant acculturation, cultural identity, social exclusion, stigma, discrimination, and the psychology of terrorism and homegrown radicalization, which is obviously of interest to all of us, but also very much at the forefront of domestic and foreign policy. In fact, her work has received so much attention from scientists as well as non-scientists. So just a few months ago, she talked about her research at Capitol Hill, and I'm told this weekend she's presenting at TEDx, so that's really exciting. She's also received numerous fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and she received the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues Dissertation Award in 2015. Today she's going to be talking to us about belonging nowhere, marginalization, and risk for radicalization among Muslim immigrants. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Lyon Padilla.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. Yes, I'm here to talk about a topic that is in a lot of people's minds right now, a topic that's dominated the headlines in the media recently. That is the threat of ISIS and violent extremism in the name of Islam. To name a few of these recent incidents, there were last month's attacks in Brussels, the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino at the end of last year. And then even before ISIS was really on our radar, there were the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013. And then as far back as in 2010, the failed Times Square bombing. And what all of these incidents have in common is that the perpetrators were actually residents or even citizens of the countries that they were targeting. And this presents a really puzzling question. Why would someone want to turn against their own country? And ISIS is explicitly right now trying to recruit Muslims living in the West. They have this glossy magazine, has a really high production value. It's in English, and they're trying to appeal to not Muslims who live in the Middle East, but actually who live in the U.S. or who live in Europe. And so this has become a question for both academics and policymakers alike. Not only why would someone become a terrorist, but why would someone actually turn against their own country? And so first I just want to address and dispel a few myths about radicalization. Maybe not so much in this room, but there is a tendency for people to ascribe causes relating to the individual. So terrorists are just uneducated, they're economically disadvantaged, perhaps they're psychologically unstable or have some kind of personality characteristic that puts them at risk. And then another common refrain is, oh, well, Islam is an inherently violent religion and therefore all terrorists are religious. But what we actually know is that it's not really a good guy, bad guy issue. In fact, researchers haven't been able to identify any kind of particular personality type. Terrorists do not appear to suffer from psychopathological disorders more so than the regular population. And religion doesn't appear to necessarily be a main motivator. And in fact, a lot of would-be terrorists are actually religious novices or converts. And one example is that in 2014, there were 2 British men who were jailed on terrorism charges, and the authorities found that they had actually ordered Islam for Dummies off of Amazon before going to fight in Syria. So these were not, extremely religious men, and in many cases, religion is used to legitimize personal and collective frustrations and justify violent ideologies rather than the other way around. But what terrorism researchers have theorized is that a lot of people are experiencing some sort of identity crisis on the path to radicalization, trying to understand who they are. And perhaps they have experienced some sort of threat to their sense of significance, the sense that they matter, they have meaning in their lives. And this threat to significance can come about in a number of ways, by being humiliated, being shamed, experiencing some sort of personal trauma, some sort of shock to your sense of self-worth. And radical organizations are smart. They have a pretty good lay theory of psychology, and they exploit individuals' needs and take advantage of these vulnerabilities. And they're really good at providing a few things to would-be recruits, such as a sense of certainty. Terrorist organizations have very clear ideologies, strong norms, us versus them mentalities. You know who's with us, who's against us. They also offer status and recognition to people who work on their behalf. And a key component of what they offer is a sense of belongingness. Belongingness is a key source of how we derive our sense of worth and significance. And the groups we belong to tell us who we are. They make us feel good about ourselves. And so these groups are good at satisfying these needs. And one source of belongingness, which is particularly relevant in the context of homegrown radicalization of immigrants, is cultural identities. And immigrants have to play this kind of cultural balancing act, the extent to which they feel like they identify with their larger society culture, but also to the extent to which they feel like they maintain connections to the culture of their heritage. And so this quadrant up here was formulated by the psychologist John Barry, and this is the overarching framework in a lot of acculturation research. And so this green one here is integration. This is kind of the best case scenario. This is people who feel like they are able to forge a connection with a larger society, but also maintain connection to their cultural heritage. And decades of psychology research have suggested that people who feel integrated are the best off psychologically, socially, professionally, scholastically. And then there are these guys, those who feel like they don't really identify with a larger society culture so much, but do have a good connection to their heritage culture. These people are thought to be separated. And then on the diagonal, those who feel like they do really identify with a larger society, but don't have such a strong connection to their own heritage culture, are thought to be assimilated. And these people are kind of better or worse off depending on the context. So they at least have some sense of belongingness. They have a cultural identity that belongs to them. But those who are assimilated may feel like they don't really know so much about where they come from. Those who are separated may feel like they have trouble socializing with others, let's say in the US, and other Americans in school or at work. And then there are the marginalized, and these are the people who I call culturally homeless. They don't really feel a part of American society, but they also don't really feel very well connected with people from their own cultural heritage. And the acculturation research has shown that these people tend to suffer the most in terms of their psychological well-being and their sociocultural adjustment. And so just as an example of how we would relate this back to the theme of homegrown radicalization, is you might recognize this picture, Tamerlan and Sokhar Tsarnaev. These were the Boston Marathon bombers. Tamerlan on the right was the older brother, and he had never really clicked with other Americans very well. He claimed to have never had an American friend. And he did have one passion, which was boxing, but he was barred from participating in a national tournament because he wasn't a US citizen. And Sokhar, and I should add, these brothers had lived in the US for about 10 years. They weren't US citizens. They were ethnic Chechens, but had grown up all around the Eastern Europe before settling in the US. And Sokhar on the left was a younger brother, and he didn't seem to have so much trouble socializing with his American peers, but he had recently expressed an interest in learning more about his Chechen roots, because as I said, his family had grown up in a lot of different places, and he didn't really feel like he was rooted anywhere in particular. So this was the story of two young men who were struggling to find their place in society. And then on top of dealing with this cultural balancing act, where do I fit in? Then there's Islamophobia. And we know in psychology that the psychological effects of discrimination are very grave. They can make people feel like they don't matter. They can cause us hostility and aggression. So they really present a threat to people's sense of significance or self-worth. And so what I was beginning to theorize is that, well, discrimination hurts everyone, but it might actually be the most harmful for the culturally homeless people, the people who don't feel like they at least have a group to which they can say, I belong here. And as I noted before, radical organizations do a remarkably good job of satisfying these needs for safety and security and belongingness. This is a tweet from a woman born in the West who joined the Islamic State. She says, "Born and raised in the West, I've never felt more safe and protected than in ISIS. Even with all the strikes, crazy drivers, and impending world war, ISIS equals love." That's a pretty strong statement here for someone to weigh all of the horrible things that are involved with joining as a foreign fighter versus the safety and security that belonging in this group provides. I think this was something worth more study. And so what I did was, with my colleagues at the University of Maryland and also with a community and educational-based organization in the DC area called WORD, the World Organization for Resource and Development, did a survey with 198 Muslims in America, about half of whom were immigrant-born and the other half who were American-born citizens. And we preceded these with interviews with about 20 immigrants and American-born Muslims to ask them about their experiences, to make sure that these were captured in our survey materials. And the interviews were incredibly rich, and I could spend an entire talk just about those, but we didn't do as much of a systematic analysis of these, so I will intersperse the rest of the slides with a few really interesting quotes, but I won't talk about them as much in general today. So we focused on, in our survey, people who were about 18 to 35 years old, and we sampled from, I think, about 20 different heritage countries, but about half of the sample were people who reported that their family had come from Pakistan. And so some of the questions we asked about their American identities, their cultural identities, and we tapped into this feeling of cultural homelessness. So, for example, sometimes I feel like I don't really belong to any culture. We asked about their experiences of discrimination or exclusion. Did they ever feel like they had been mistreated, or members of their family or their friends mistreated because of their religion or culture? And then we asked them about feelings of significance loss. Had they ever felt hopeless, meaningless, rejected, disconnected? And then we tried to tap into some indices of support for radicalism. And obviously, a clear constraint with this kind of research is it's very difficult to establish cause and effect relationships, because it's not like psychologists or any researcher for that matter has a readily available sample of terrorists who want to complete surveys or participate in experiments. So what we did was we worked with our colleagues to come up with some indicators that might represent facets of radicalism that we could measure people's support. So for example, one was support for fundamentalist groups. We wrote a description of a group that had been modeled after prior research on radicalization, and we adapted it to fit the Muslim American community context. So it was a group of Muslims in America who were upset about injustices from American society and would go to, would at any cost, would avenge these injustices. And we didn't specifically invoke discussion of violence, but it was very clear that there was no limit to what the group would do to achieve their goals. And we tested this in advance to make sure that it was simultaneously considered to be very extreme, but not so extreme that no one would endorse it, and also to make sure that it wasn't, let's say, too the opposite, non-extreme, so that if someone were to endorse it, it would be inappropriate to interpret that as support for a fundamentalist group. We also measured readiness to self-sacrifice for a cause. Would you be willing to give up your life, your wealth, connections with your friends and family to defend a cause that you strongly believed in? And then we worked with our partners to develop some items that tapped into radical interpretation of Islam. And so a couple of these items, for example, were that combative jihad is the only way to conduct jihad, or that it is important to give to Islamic charities even if their ideological beliefs may be extreme at times. And if anyone has more interest in the specifics of these measures, I can talk to you more about them a little bit later. And so here's the part where I show graphs. And I wasn't sure about this room's comfort with statistical analyses or not, so I didn't want to overwhelm people who don't have a strong foundation in stats, and I also don't want to be patronizing to those who do. So what I'm going to show here are some kind of basic graphs, and if anyone is dying for the regression coefficients and the standard errors, these can be found in the I can see some like, ooh, numbers. This paper recently came out in Behavioral Science and Policy, and all of the analyses can be found there. So what we found is that people who reported feeling marginalized, culturally homeless, like they didn't really belong anywhere, were more likely to report this lack of significance in their lives. And the same was true for discrimination. The more people felt like they'd been discriminated against, the more they reported this loss of significance. And what's more, this red dotted line shows that the effects of discrimination on significance loss were even worse for people who already felt culturally homeless, who didn't feel like they at least belonged somewhere. And in turn, this lack of significance was related to increased support for this hypothetical fundamentalist group, as well as readiness to sacrifice oneself for a cause, and also possessing a radical interpretation of Islam. But as we know, this isn't an issue that's only relevant in the US, and in fact, this is a huge topic in Europe right now. And in Germany in particular, there have been a lot of tensions between the Muslim community and the larger German society that have resulted in the rise of some white right-wing groups. For example, one called Pegida, which stands for something along the lines of patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West. And there's been a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric and also concern that people might go to fight for ISIS and come back equipped to carry out attacks on German soil. And so we did the same study with Germans. We interviewed a small sample of Muslim Germans in advance to learn more about their experiences. And this survey was with about the same number, 204. We did this in conjunction with Jacobs University in Bremen. And as compared to the American sample, the vast majority of this sample came from a Turkish heritage background. And so what we found is some patterns that were similar. So we did find that marginalization was related to this threat to one's sense of significance or self-worth. And that this was also true for experiences of discrimination, and that these interacted with each other, so discrimination was worse the more you felt culturally homeless. And in turn, this lack of significance also predicted supporting a radical interpretation of Islam. But that was where the similarities ended. The lack of significance did not actually predict readiness to self-sacrifice or support for this radical group. But what we did find that was interesting, which we didn't find in the US sample, was the role of separation. We had also included these other cultural acculturation orientations to make sure that when we were looking at marginalization, we were looking at marginalization taking into effect how they felt about assimilation, separation, integration, and so on. And so whereas in the American sample, it was really only marginalization that led to the sense of significance loss. Separation, assimilation, didn't. Integration was the opposite. The more you felt integrated, the less you felt the sense of significance loss. And it makes a lot of sense because you might conceptualize integration as kind of lying on the opposite end of the spectrum as marginalization. But in Germany, the more people felt separated, the more they reported this lack of significance, and the more they also supported this radical interpretation of Islam and the support for a fundamentalist group. And this is something I've been trying to search for a psychological explanation for in the data, and I haven't really found anything. So that's why I'm bringing it up to this room, because I have a feeling that there are a lot of cultural experts in this room who might be able to weigh in on why exactly this is happening. But another thing that we did look at was some differences between the US and Germany. And we found that, in general, the support for radicalism was higher in the German sample than it was in the American sample. And as well, Muslims in the US reported feeling more integrated than they did in Germany. And so we started thinking about, well, what's different about the American and the German cultural context that might explain these differences? And so one dimension of cultural that we looked at was tightness and looseness. This is something that my advisor back at the University of Maryland is an expert in, cultural tightness and looseness, which has to do with the extent to which there are strong norms in society and penalties from deviating from these norms. So Germany is thought to be a fairly tight country on the spectrum, and the US fairly loose. So there are some good things and some bad things about tightness. In tight contexts where there are strong norms, things are very predictable. There's often less crime. The trains run on time. But on the flip side, there are strong penalties from deviating. So this is very troubling for people who might belong to stigmatized groups. And this includes minorities who might be seen as not acting German, not being able to fit the expectations for what it constitutes to be a good German. And tightness has already been found to play some role in radicalization, such that in tighter contexts, there's less leeway for adjusting grievances. And so people who live in looser cultures see more mundane acts of civic engagement as being effective in expressing your grievances and making change. But in tighter contexts, these don't work. And so radical action is needed to get your message across, to get things done. And so in our data, indeed, this was consistent with what my advisor had found. The Muslim Germans reported that Germany was much tighter than the US when it came to expectations for behaving in a certain way, consequences for not doing so. And we also found that our German sample perceived the host country, that being Germany, to be much more closed-minded to diversity than the US. And these items were something along the lines of people here are not actually as open-minded as they think they are, as they would like to be. This was something that had come up in our interviews a lot. Even in the US, people said, the US prides itself on being very culturally diverse and very open-minded, but when push comes to shove, this is very shallow, and people aren't really genuinely interested in learning more about my background, where I come from, what my cultural customs and practices are, than they may seem. And so with all of these differences taken together, we looked at a path model, which showed that actually differences in tightness between the US and in Germany, and this plus sign in the beginning doesn't really mean anything. It means that Germany was higher on this tightness measure than was the US. This report of cultural tightness predicted reports that the host country was very closed-minded to diversity. And this in turn related to lower integration. So the more people felt like their host country was very closed off to diversity, the less well integrated they were. And then this in turn explained these country differences and readiness to self-sacrifice. And the same was true for possessing a radical interpretation of Islam. So this is something that's interesting, that we're looking more into what characteristics of the host society might influence the way people's cultural identities and discrimination experiences are presenting as risk or protective factors. And so to address some of the limitations here before I go on into the implications of the research, is that this was not a representative sample. It was a fairly small sample. It was only about 200 people in each country. And we did manage to sample from about 26 different states in the US, but it was still by no means considered representative of the whole country. And we were working with our partners to sample within their network, in their organization, but everyone had to opt in. So it wasn't truly random. It was also cross-sectional design, meaning that everyone took the survey at one time. So you can't really generate any kind of causal conclusions about what was going on here. You can entertain alternative hypotheses. So maybe the readiness to self-sacrifice causes this loss of significance. But given what we know about radical organizations and what they provide to recruit, it's unlikely that this was happening. But what's a little bit harder to tell is what's going on with the cultural identities. It could be that as people become more radicalized, that affects the way they feel like they connect to American society and so forth. So it'll be important in the future to do more longitudinal research so we can see how you feel like you identify with your cultures right now influences how you feel psychologically, how you feel towards radical groups and causes in the future. And again, as I stated earlier, these were just proxy measures for radicalism. So there's still a large jump between people expressing attitudes and actually buying a plane ticket and going to fight in Syria. And we can't capture that difference in the data that we collected. And so going forward, some things that we might like to explore is a radicalization cycle. And by that, I mean, I've been focusing here on Muslim Americans and their experiences of cultural homelessness, being discriminated against. But that comes from somewhere too, right? So every time there's some terrorist attack that's in the news, you hear there's a wave of Islamophobia that follows. And so according to my data, we might expect that this increased association between Islam and violence is producing this Islamophobia that's then leading to the discrimination and the cultural homelessness that would cause the significance loss. And so what we want to do is look at the cycle in full and then try to target parts of the cycle. I come from what we call in the psychology department a do tank, not a think tank. So we're part not just understanding psychology as it relates to the real world, but actually doing something about it, trying to create interventions where possible. And so I would like to see if it's possible to intervene on this cycle, both on the Muslim American side, Muslim German side, and also the larger society side. What can be done to decrease that association between Islam and violence and stifle these Islamophobic reactions that often occur? And I'm also interested in applying this model in non-immigrant contexts. And I often get questions like, well, how does this relate to people joining gangs? It seems like gangs probably satisfy a lot of the similar psychological needs, and I think that's probably a very good hypothesis, and it's one that we haven't tested, but we certainly could. And another thing is I've been thinking lately that this model probably applies very well to some of the political phenomenon going on in this country right now. I don't want to get too political, but you have a white working class who is, in a different sense, marginalized, who may feel like they're not being served very well by the political process, but don't belong to a group that's considered to be disadvantaged or warrant the consideration of policies to help support them, help make them thrive. And they're finding appeal in ideologies that are very clear-cut, good guy, bad guy, I'm going to listen to your voice, I'm going to speak for you. And so that's something where I have a little preliminary data on this suggesting that maybe there's something to this. But that'll be something to explore more in the future. And so the implications for these results, this pattern that cultural homelessness and discrimination can produce the sense of significance loss that can propel people towards finding a sense of belongingness and security in radical groups and causes. This has direct implications for policy, and this is what I talked about a little bit when I visited Capitol Hill in February. But it's very abstract, right? It's difficult to come up with really tangible solutions other than let's be inclusive towards everyone. But one big part of this is creating a culture for integration. There's this common misconception that Muslims in the US don't want to integrate. I see this all the time. All you have to do, and I don't necessarily recommend this, is visit the comment section of an article online. When I wrote an article in the fall about my research and it came out, and I was getting lots of emails saying, well, but the thing is, Muslim Americans don't want to integrate. And I want to ask them, because I don't reply, but if I did, I would say, where did you get this data? Because actually I have this data set, and it tells me that the vast majority, like 90%, actually say that they want to integrate, their cultural heritage with that of, their American identity. And so that's something that's not to be understated. And what's also important here is to distinguish between integration and assimilation. Just this morning, I read an article that came from the Brookings Institute that said something along the lines of the same message, like we can help fight terrorism by promoting assimilation. And I was like, close, but not actually, because the difference between integration and assimilation is, assimilation is this old melting pot metaphor, is that we all come from these different places and we kind of melt away our cultural distinctiveness and become this new great American identity. And that metaphor has kind of fallen out of fashion for the mixed salad or cultural mosaic approach, which is we all have our individual unique cultural pieces, which we put into this delicious salad, which as a whole tastes great, but you can totally distinguish, the olives from the feta cheese and the lemon vinaigrette dressing and whatnot. And I haven't eaten yet, sorry. So I think it's important to distinguish between these because a lot of people throw around words like assimilation very easily without thinking about what that actually means. And so what we should be promoting is not that everyone just leave their culture at the door in order to become American, but that actually for them to thrive and to reduce the chances that people would experience a threat to the sense of self-significance that increases the attractiveness of radical groups and ideologies, we should be promoting integration, preserving one's cultural heritage, not making people give that up. And here's where I have some fun quotes. One woman from my interview said, I think part of the reason I wear the headscarf like this, which as it was an oral interview, so I'm not sure, is because Americans need to know that it's not something that's ancient, limiting, or oppressing. It's still fashionable. It's a way to express yourself. And you can still love yourself when you wear the hijab and love the way you wear it. And you can make the scarf look more American. You can show that you're proud to be American, and you're still proud to be a Muslim at the same time. And I think that's important for Americans to understand, is that there are a lot of different ways one can be American, and it doesn't just have to be your way of doing it. And the other take-home policy point is that anti-Muslim rhetoric is not only not helpful, but it's actually counterproductive, because the reactions of politicians, of everyday Americans that follow terrorist incidents, that follow news about threats of ISIS, just reinforce the ISIS narrative that the West is anti-Islam, and it's increasing its appeal for Muslims who are feeling marginalized and discriminated against and looking for opportunities to regain the sense of significance. And so, racial profiling and spying programs, community policing programs, these are all likely to engender distrust, produce these feelings of discrimination, make people feel like they're not really American but aren't allowed to express their own cultural heritage either. And this is where they come in and on the cycle and perpetuate these conditions that might actually increase the risk of radicalization, not decrease it. And but this comes because we've been served this sort of false choice between either we are very inclusive and we help America's Muslims integrate, or we protect our country. But what my data suggests is that it's not one or the other. It's actually part of the same solution. By creating a culture of integration, by condemning Islamophobia and hateful speech, we can actually protect our country by making people feel more at home. There are a couple of examples of discrimination that I wanted to share because these couldn't be captured in the survey. This is a woman who said, I'm a recording artist, and I've had the opportunity to sign for a major label on the condition that I shred my Muslim identity and refrain from talking about my ethnicity in order to win over appeal from demographics that regularly wouldn't approve of a Pakistani Muslim singer. I have a Muslim stage name, and their conditions were strict in a contract stating that I would have to change my name. I was unable to complete the contract. So it's not just about politicians saying we need to bar Muslims from entering the country, whoever they are who said that, or we need to police communities to make sure that we find signs of radicalization before it's too late. This is about being forced to shred your cultural identity at work, for that to limit you professionally. There was also another participant who said, I've been called a terrorist on numerous occasions. I've been asked to apologize for September 11th. I've been asked if I have a visa to be here, even though I have an American accent. And as an artist, I'm expected to make a certain type of artwork because I'm brown. Often people are disappointed that my work isn't more Eastern, that I have a Western approach. I don't experience as much discrimination as others because I act and dress and speak in a more Americanized way, but I see it, I hear it, and see it happening around me, and it's very disheartening. And this is kind of an example of how people get forced into this cultural homelessness category. Being asked if you have a visa to be here when you are, in fact, born in the US. Being told that your Western style of art is disappointing because they want it to be more Eastern. How is someone supposed to feel like they belong here or there if they're being told they can't belong anywhere? But the good news is, as I said, the vast majority of people in my sample did say that they wanted to integrate aspects of their American cultural identity and their own cultural identities. And this was the case by and large in Germany as well. These people were less likely to lack the sense of significance, and they were also less affected by discrimination. And so discrimination is across the board very harmful. But people who are integrated, who feel like, you know what, I have a foot in both doors, in both worlds, they're better able to deal with it. And I thought this was a really interesting statement of how someone negotiated their own cultural identities and found a way to be at peace with not being 100% here nor there. They said, balancing two different cultural identities is extremely hard because you'll never be able to achieve 100% of either of them. While people who've only lived in one culture would be able to automatically do that. And I think that's a thing that a lot of people without recent immigrant heritage backgrounds assume. They say, why is it so hard to just become American? Well, they themselves have never been forced to deal with this cultural balancing act that so many immigrants or minorities have to deal with. So what they said is, well, what I learned is I should never really strive for that 100%. I'm pure Afghan, or, oh, I've become Americanized. Instead, have the core components of an Afghan culture and then decorate that with stuff I've learned over here. I think that's how I define myself. So some promising directions going forward. I've been harping on the negative, but there's actually a lot that's good that's going on. So for example, the main function of me showing this tweet is because I got the White House to retweet me on their big block of cheese day. It's some sort of cheese-themed public engagement social media day where people from different agencies and offices go and interact with the American people of Twitter. And it was shortly after the State of the Union where President Obama had said we need to reject politics that targets people because of race and religion. And what I had to say, remember this is cheese-themed, research shows anti-Muslim rhetoric is likely to fuel support for ISIS, not squelch it. Can you weigh in? And so, yes, first the White House told me I had great puns, which is really how I make my own sense of meaning in life. And the administration is really making a key point of communicating that we should condemn Islamophobia, that we should not accept politics that targets people because of race and religion. And the White House had a summit on countering violent extremism earlier in 2015. And this is kind of, policy directions. So they've emphasized the role of local communities in combating radicalization. So it's not something that should just come from law enforcement. We're here to punish you, to get you in trouble, but actually involve local communities in helping steer people towards a path where they might be able to satisfy their sense of significance in a more socially beneficial way than turning to radicalism. They're looking to address social grievances that radical groups exploit, which my data would suggest is a very important move going forward. And also strengthening protections for religious and ethnic minorities. And for example, there's a program in Denmark right now, which is a partnership between law enforcement and local religious communities where religious leaders and law enforcement go in together as a partnership to find people who are at risk and say, what can we do? How can we help you feel like you're a good Danish citizen while also being a good Muslim. And these tactics are likely to be much more effective than law enforcement swooping in and making people feel like they have to be scared and with no other path forward. I don't know if anyone read this. About a week or so ago, there was something in the New York Times about a family from Fremont, right here in the Bay. A young man who had, increasingly been showing signs of becoming radicalized, and his father, who, from my understanding, was not particularly religious himself and was not really sure how his son had jumped onto this ideology, was struggling with how to handle this. What could he do? And so what he did was he contacted law enforcement, trusting them to help him to take care of his son. But what they did was they swooped in and arrested him. And I'm not sure if they've made a sentence yet, but he's likely facing years and years of jail, whereas he hadn't actually done anything yet, and his father was desperately looking for a way to help rehabilitate him, not punish him. So it will be important going forward for programs at the national and the community level to work more cooperatively to help steer people who may be at risk towards a safer path. And so also on a positive note, I want to end on this really fitting quote from when President Obama visited a mosque in Baltimore in February. And he had these words to say to American Muslims: "You fit in here, right here. You're right where you belong. You're part of America too. You aren't Muslim or American. You're Muslim and American." And that's exactly the message that we should be sending to the Muslim American community, so that we can make it harder for terrorists to recruit by making the culturally homeless feel more at home. Thank you. I'd like to thank my collaborators at the University of Maryland, Ward at Jacobs University, and I'm happy to take any questions.